The Islamic Golden Age refers to the period in the history of Islam, traditionally dated from the 8th century to the 13th century, when much of the historically Islamic world was ruled by various caliphates, experiencing a scientific, economic and cultural flourishing. This period is traditionally understood to have begun during the reign of the Abbasid caliph Harun al-Rashid with the inauguration of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where scholars from various parts of the world with different cultural backgrounds were mandated to gather and translate all of the world's classical knowledge into Arabic. It is traditionally said to have ended with the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate with the Mongol invasions and the sack of Baghdad in 1258, though several contemporary scholars place the end of the Islamic Golden Age around the 15th to 16th centuries. History of the concept. The metaphor of a golden age began to be applied in 19th-century literature about Islamic history, in the context of the Western cultural fashion of Orientalism. The author of a handbook for travelers in Syria and Palestine in 1868 observed that the most beautiful mosques of Damascus were, like Mohammedanism itself, now rapidly decaying, and relics of the Golden Age of Islam. There is no unambiguous definition of term, and depending on whether it is used with a focus on cultural or on military achievement, it may be taken to refer to rather disparate time spans. Thus, one author would have it extend to the duration of the Caliphate, or to 6.5 centuries, while another would have it end after only a few decades of Rashidun conquests, with the death of Umar and the first fitna. During the early 20th century, the term was used only occasionally, and often referred to the early military successes of the Rashidun caliphs. It was only in the second half of the 20th century that the term came to be used with any frequency, now mostly referring to the cultural flourishing of science and mathematics under the Caliphate during the 9th to 11th centuries, but often extended to include part of the late 8th or the 12th to early 13th centuries. Definitions may still vary considerably, equating the end of the Golden Age with the end of the Caliphate as a convenient cut-off point based on a historical landmark, but it can be argued that Islamic culture had entered a gradual decline much earlier. Thus, Khan identifies the proper Golden Age as being the 2 centuries between 750 to 950, arguing that the beginning loss of territories under Harun al-Rashid worsened after the death of al-Ma'mun in 833, and that the Crusades in the 12th century resulted in a further weakening of the Abbasid Empire from which it never recovered. Causes. Religious influence. The various Quranic injunctions and hadith, which place values on education and emphasize the importance of acquiring knowledge, played a vital role in influencing the Muslims of this age in their search for knowledge and the development of the body of science. Earlier cultural influence. During this period, the Muslims showed a strong interest in assimilating the scientific knowledge of the civilizations that had been conquered. Many classic works of antiquity that might otherwise have been lost were translated from Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, Chinese, Egyptian, and Phoenician civilizations into Arabic and Persian, and later in turn translated into Turkish, Hebrew, and Latin. Christians contributed to the Arab-Islamic civilization during the Umayyad and the Abbasid periods by translating works of Greek philosophers to Syriac and afterwards to Arabic. During the 4th through the 7th centuries, scholarly work in the Syriac and Greek languages was either newly initiated, or carried on from the Hellenistic period. Centers of learning and of transmission of classical wisdom included colleges such as the School of Nisibis, and later the School of Edessa, and the renowned Hospital and Medical Academy of Jungdashipur. Libraries included the Library of Alexandria and the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Other centers of translation and learning functioned at Merv, Salonika, Nishapur and Cte-Siphon, situated just south of what later became Baghdad. Nestorians played a prominent role in the formation of Arab culture, especially at Jungtashapur school. Notably, 8 generations of the Nestorian Bukhshu family served as private doctors to caliphs and sultans between the 8th and 11th centuries. Government sponsorship. The Muslim government heavily patronized scholars. The money spent on the translation movement for some translations is estimated to be equivalent to about twice the annual research budget of the United Kingdom's Medical Research Council. The best scholars and notable translators, such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq, had salaries that are estimated to be the equivalent of professional athletes today. The House of Wisdom was a library, translation institute, and academy established in Abbasid-era Baghdad, Iraq by Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'mun. New technology with a new and easier writing system, and the introduction of paper, information was democratized to the extent that, for probably the first time in history, it became possible to make a living from simply writing and selling books. The use of paper spread from China into Muslim regions in the 8th century, arriving in Al-Andalus on the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain in the 10th century. It was easier to manufacture than parchment, less likely to crack than papyrus, and could absorb ink, making it difficult to erase and ideal for keeping records. Islamic papermakers devised assembly line methods of hand-copying manuscripts to turn out editions far larger than any available in Europe for centuries. It was from these countries that the rest of the world learned to make paper from linen. Philosophy. Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina played a major role in saving the works of Aristotle, whose ideas came to dominate the non-religious thought of the Christian and Muslim worlds. Islamic scholars would also absorb ideas from China and India, adding to the tremendous knowledge from their own studies. Ibn Sina and other philosophers such as al-Kindi and al-Farabi combined Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism with other ideas introduced through Islam. Arabic philosophic literature was translated into Latin and Ladino, contributing to the development of modern European philosophy. During this period, non-Muslims were allowed to flourish relative to their treatment in the Christian Byzantine Empire. The Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, who lived in Andalusia, is an example. Avicenna argued his floating man thought experiment concerning self-awareness, in which a man prevented of sense experience by being blindfolded and free-falling would still be aware of his existence. In epistemology, Ibn Tufayl wrote the novel Hay ibn Yaqdan, and in response Ibn al-Nafis wrote the novel Theologus Autodidactis. Both were concerning autodidacticism as illuminated through the life of a feral child spontaneously generated in a cave on a desert island. Mathematics. Algebra. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi played a significant role in the development of algebra, algorithms, and Hindu-Arabic numerals. The art uses symmetric polygonal shapes to create patterns that, without leaving gaps, can continue indefinitely without repeating its pattern, in a way that can be directly compared to what are now considered quasi-crystals. It was previously thought that Islamic design was done with straight-edge rulers and compasses, but Lew and Steinhardt now argue that the patterns were created by tessellating a small number of different tiles with complex shapes, evolving into what would now be described as quasi-periodic shapes by the 15th century. The Swedish Academy, which granted Dan Shechtman the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his discovery of quasi-crystals in molecular structures, stated, "Aperiodic mosaics, such as those found in the medieval Islamic mosaics of the Alhambra Palace in Spain and the Darbai Imam Shrine in Iran, have helped scientists understand what quasi-crystals look like at the atomic level." Trigonometry. Ibn Muadh al-Jayana introduced the general law of sines in his The Book of Unknown Arcs of a Sphere in the 11th century. This formula relates the lengths of the sides of any triangle, rather than only right triangles, to the sines of its angles. According to the law, where A, B, and C are the lengths of the sides of a triangle, and E, B, and C are the opposite angles, calculus. Al-Hasan discovered the sum formula for the fourth power, using a method that could be generally used to determine the sum for any integral power. He used this to find the volume of a paraboloid. He could find the integral formula for any polynomial without having developed a general formula. Scientific method. Ibn al-Haytham was a significant figure in the history of scientific method, particularly in his approach to experimentation, and has been referred by some to be the world's first true scientist. The physician Rhazes was an early proponent of experimental medicine and recommended using control for clinical research. He said, "If you want to study the effect of bloodletting on a condition, divide the patients into two groups, perform bloodletting only on one group, watch both, and compare the results." Jim al-Khalili gives the example of the classification of materials as a sign of new ways of thinking. While the classification of the material world by the ancient Indians and Greeks into air, earth, fire and water was more philosophical, medieval Islamic scientists used practical, experimental observation to classify materials. Rhazes, for example, classified minerals into 6 groups based on their observed chemical properties: spirits, which were flammable; material bodies, which were shiny and malleable; salts, which could dissolve in water; vitriols, stones, and boraxes. Physics. Astronomy. In about 964 AD, Persian astronomer Abd al-Rahman al-Sufi, writing in his Book of Fixed Stars, described a nebulous spot in the Andromeda constellation, the first definitive reference to what we now know as the Andromeda Galaxy, the nearest spiral galaxy to our galaxy. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi invented a geometrical technique called a Tusi couple, which generates linear motion from the sum of two circular motions to replace Ptolemy's problematica quant. The Tusi couple was later employed in Ibn al-Shatir's geocentric model and Nicolaus Copernicus' heliocentric Copernican model, although it is not known who the intermediary is or if Copernicus rediscovered the technique independently. Optics. Al-Hasan played a significant role in the development of optics, experimental physics, and theoretical physics. Biology. In his survey of the history of the ideas which led to the theory of natural selection, Conway Zirkle noted that Al-Jahiz was one of those who discussed a struggle for existence in his Kitab al-Hayawan, written in the 9th century. Anatomy and the cardiovascular system. Ibn al-Nafis, in his commentary on Anatomy in Avicenna's canon, was the first to contradict the contention of the Galen school that blood could pass between the ventricles in the heart through the cardiac interventricular septum that separates them, saying that there is no passage between the ventricles at this point. Instead, he correctly argued that all the blood that reached the left ventricle did so after passing through the lung. He also stated that there must be small communications, or pores, between the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein, a prediction that preceded the discovery of the pulmonary capillaries of Marcello Malpighi by 400 years. The commentary was rediscovered in the 20th century in the Prussian State Library in Berlin. Whether its view of the pulmonary circulation influenced scientists such as Michael Servetus is unclear, as it was not published and only 5 copies were made. In the nervous system, Rhazes stated that nerves had motor or sensory functions, describing 7 cranial and 31 spinal cord nerves. He assigned a numerical order to the cranial nerves from the optic to the hypoglossal nerves. He classified the spinal nerves into 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 3 sacral, and 3 coccygeal nerves. He used this to link clinical signs of injury to the corresponding location of lesions in the nervous system. Medicine. Rhazes differentiated through careful observation the 2 diseases, smallpox and measles, which were previously lumped together as a single disease that cause rashes. This was based on location and the time of the appearance of the symptoms, and he also scaled the degree of severity and prognosis of infections according to the color and location of rashes. On hygienic practices, Rhazes, who was once asked to choose the site for a new hospital in Baghdad, suspended pieces of meat at various points around the city, and recommended building the hospital at the location where the meat putrefied most slowly. For Islamic scholars, Indian and Greek physicians and medical researchers Sushruta, Galen, Manka, Atreya, Hippocrates, Karika, and Agnivsa were preeminent authorities. In order to make the Indian and Greek tradition more accessible, understandable, and teachable, Islamic scholars ordered and made more systematic the vast Indian and Greco-Roman medical knowledge by writing encyclopedias and summaries. Sometimes, past scholars were criticized, like Rhazes who criticized and refuted Galen's revered theories, most notably the theory of humours, and was thus accused of ignorance. It was through 12th century Arabic translations that medieval Europe rediscovered Hellenic medicine, including the works of Galen and Hippocrates, and discovered ancient Indian medicine, including the works of Sushruta and Karika. Works such as Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine were translated into Latin and disseminated throughout Europe. During the 15th and 16th centuries alone, the Canon of Medicine was published more than 35 times. Engineering. The Banu Musa brothers, in their Book of Ingenious Devices, describe automatic flute player, which may have been the first programmable machine. The flute sounds were produced through hot steam, and the user could adjust the device to various patterns so that they could get various sounds from it. Institutions. Healthcare hospitals in this era were the first to require medical diplomas to license doctors. In the medieval Islamic world, hospitals were built in most major cities. Medical facilities traditionally closed each night, but by the 10th century laws were passed to keep hospitals open 24 hours a day, and hospitals were forbidden to turn away patients who were unable to pay. Eventually, charitable foundations called huaqs were formed to support hospitals, as well as schools. This money supported free medical care for all citizens. In a notable example, a 13th-century governor of Egypt, al-Mansur Kaloran, ordained a foundation for the Kaloran hospital that would contain a mosque and a chapel, separate wards for different diseases, a library for doctors, and a pharmacy. The Kaloran hospital was based in a former Fatimid palace which had accommodation for 8,000 people. It served 4,000 patients daily. The WAQF stated, "The hospital shall keep all patients, men and women, until they are completely recovered. All costs are to be borne by the hospital, whether the people come from afar or near, whether they are residents or foreigners, strong or weak, low or high, rich or poor, employed or unemployed, blind or sighted, physically or mentally ill, learned or illiterate. There are no conditions of consideration and payment. None is objected to or even indirectly hinted at for non-payment. Education. The Guinness World Records recognizes the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in 859 AD, as the world's oldest degree-granting university. The Al-Azhar University was the first university in the East, and perhaps the oldest in history. The madrasa is one of the relics of the Fatimid dynasty era of Egypt, descended from Fatima, daughter of Muhammad. Fatima was called Arizona Zara, and it was named in her honor. It was founded as a mosque by the Fatimid commander Jafar, at the orders of the Caliph al-Mu'izz as he founded the city for Cairo. It was in Jamadi al-Awwal in the year 359 AH. Its building was completed on the 9th of Ramadan in the year 361 AH. Both al-Aziz Billah and al-Hakim by Amr Allah added to its premises. It was further repaired, renovated, and extended by al-Mustanzir Billah and al-Hafiz Din Illah. Fatimid caliphs always encouraged scholars and jurists to have their study circles and gatherings in this mosque, and thus it was turned into a university. Al-Azhar University now has the claim of being the oldest university still functioning. The intellectual life in Egypt during the Fatimid era reached a great degree of progress and activity due to the number of scholars who either lived in Egypt or came from outside, as well as the number of books available. The Fatimid caliphs gave prominent positions to the scholars in their courts and encouraged the students. Fatimids paid attention to establishing libraries in the palaces so that the scholars might polish up their knowledge and get benefit of what their predecessors had done. Commerce and travel. Apart from the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates, navigable rivers were uncommon in the Middle East, so transport by sea was very important. Navigational sciences were highly developed, making use of a rudimentary sextant. When combined with detailed maps of the period, sailors were able to sail across oceans rather than skirt along the coast. Muslim sailors were also responsible for reintroducing large, three-masted merchant vessels to the Mediterranean. The name caravel may derive from an earlier Arab boat known as the Carib. During the Fatimid era, Egypt flourished and the Fatimids developed an extensive trade network in both the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Their trade and diplomatic ties extended all the way to China and its Song dynasty, which eventually determined the economic course of Egypt during the High Middle Ages. Unlike other governments in the area, Fatimid advancement in state offices was based more on merit than on heredity. Members of other branches of Islam, like the Sunnis, were just as likely to be appointed to government posts as Shiites. Tolerance was extended to non-Sunni Muslims such as Christians, Shias, and Jews, who occupied high levels in government based on ability. Tolerance was set into place to ensure the flow of money from all those who were non-Muslims too in order to finance the Fatimid caliph's large army of Mamluks brought in from Circassia by Genoese merchants.